The first time Clara May Holloway told him, "You ain't my husband," the wind carried her words across the dry yard like a challenge, sharp as barbed wire and just as painful to touch. Jonah Cross stood by the split-rail fence with dust on his boots and the sun burning low behind him. He had ridden 3 days to get there, 3 days with nothing but memory and regret for company. The ranch lay quiet, except for the creak of the old barn and the uneasy shifting of cattle. And when she said it, her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her, dark and shining with something she had not buried deep enough. Jonah knew then that lies spoken out here did not last long, not under a sky that had watched men break and women endure for generations, not on land that remembered everything. Clara stood straight on the porch of the homestead, hands clenched in her apron, the same porch where she once waited for him at sunset, the same steps where he had kissed her knuckles before riding off with promises he had failed to keep. She looked thinner now, stronger too, like grief had carved her into something sharper, something harder to bend. When Jonah met her gaze, he saw the past rising between them like heat off the prairie, the winter nights they shared, the vows never spoken but deeply felt. And the moment he left town chasing gold and foolish pride, she had told herself she survived without him. She had told the land, the neighbors, and most of all herself. Yet here he was, flesh and bone, regret riding heavy on his shoulders. He took a step forward, and the porch boards groaned. Clara flinched just enough to give herself away. Jonah did not smile, did not tip his hat. He knew better than to greet a woman guarding old wounds. "I didn't come to stir trouble," he said softly, careful not to raise his voice. "Trouble has a way of finding me anyway." The air between them tightened, and she folded her arms like a shield. "Trouble is what follows you. Jonah Cross always has, always will." Her words were hard, but her eyes flickered, searching his face for something familiar, something safe, something she hated herself for wanting to see. A child's laughter drifted from inside the house, light and sudden. Jonah stiffened as Clara turned her head sharply toward the sound. "Don't you step 1 foot closer," she warned. "You don't belong here anymore. Not in my life, not under this roof." Jonah's chest tightened as the truth dawned slow and painful. The boy that emerged onto the porch had his dark hair and his uncertain eyes. The child stopped short when he saw Jonah, curiosity plain on his face. Clara moved fast, then, placing herself between them, her hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. "This is my son," she said, and something in her voice dared Jonah to challenge that claim. Jonah swallowed hard. The words lodged in his throat like splinters. "Your son," he repeated quietly. The boy tilted his head, studying Jonah the way children do when they sense something important they do not yet understand. Clara felt the weight of Jonah's stare and tightened her grip. "He don't need you knowing him," she said, her voice trembling despite herself. Jonah nodded slowly. "I ain't asking for that," he replied, "but I ain't turning away neither, not now that I see what I left behind." The prairie wind surged between them, lifting Clara's loose hair, and Jonah remembered brushing that same strand behind her ear years ago. When the world felt simpler and promises felt lighter, the boy tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Mama, who is he?" The word mama struck Jonah harder than any fist. Clara hesitated, just long enough for the truth to breathe. Before she answered, "No one you need to worry about. Go inside." The boy obeyed, but not before flashing Jonah one last curious glance. When the door closed, silence settled, heavy and unforgiving. Clara's shoulders sagged, and for a moment the strength drained out of her. "You had no right to come back," she whispered. Jonah stepped closer now, ignoring her warning. "Every right," he said, "because I never stopped being yours, not in my heart, not in the quiet nights when the past wouldn't leave me alone." Her laugh was bitter, edged with pain. "Hearts don't put food on the table, Jonah. They don't keep a roof from caving in. They don't stay when things get hard." She looked at him fully now, eyes blazing. "Where were you when my husband died? Where were you when I buried him?" Jonah's breath caught. "Husband," the word burned. "I didn't know," he said, low and honest. Clara shook her head. "Doesn't matter. You left. Someone else stayed. Someone else loved me enough to carry the weight you dropped. The land, don't forget that. And neither do I." Jonah felt the sting of her words, but did not retreat. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the yard. "I ain't asking you to forgive me today," he said. "I ain't even asking you to trust me. All I'm asking is to let me stay long enough to prove I ain't the same man who rode away." Clara turned from him, staring out at the open fields. Her voice broke when she spoke again. "You ain't my husband," she said, but her eyes, wet and conflicted, told a different story. And Jonah knew this land had not finished with tea. Jonah stayed on the edge of her land that first night, pitching his bedroll beneath a cottonwood like a man who knew better than to push his welcome. The stars came out sharp and cold, and sleep would not take him. Every sound from the house carried meaning: the scrape of a chair, the faint cough of the boy, the low murmur of Clara's voice as she spoke bedtime prayers Jonah had once heard whispered into his chest. He remembered how she used to say, "The land listened," how it remembered promises even when people tried to forget them. Now the land listened again, and Jonah wondered if it judged him or simply waited to see if he would fail twice. Morning came hard and bright. Clara was already outside hanging wash, movements brisk and deliberate. She did not look his way, but she knew he was there. She always knew. The boy watched Jonah from the doorway, cautious but curious, and Jonah felt the pull in his chest tighten. Clara finally spoke without turning around. "You can help mend the south fence if you're set on staying." Her voice held no invitation, only condition. Jonah accepted it like a gift, working beside her land without complaint. As the day wore on, words slipped out between hammer strikes and dust clouds. Small talk about cattle prices, weather patterns, and the stubbornness of prairie grass. Yet beneath it all lay the unsaid. The pass pressing close like thunder waiting to break. By noon the sun bore down cruel and unrelenting. Clara handed Jonah a canteen without meeting his eyes. Their fingers brushed and both stilled. The moment stretched thin and dangerous. She pulled back first, turning away as if burned. "You should leave after today," she said, flat and firm. Jonah took a long drink, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and answered quietly, "I won't, not yet." She spun on him then, anger flaring hot. "You don't get to decide that, Jonah Cross. This is my life now, my child, my land, my grief. You lost your say the day you rode out." Her words cut deep, but Jonah stood his ground. "I lost a lot more than my say," he replied, "and I aim to earn something back before I go." That evening, a storm rolled in fast, black clouds swallowing the sky. Clara called the boy inside as thunder cracked like gunfire. Jonah moved without being asked, securing shutters, hauling loose boards, working like a man who belonged there. Rain came down hard, turning dirt to mud, and when lightning split the sky, the boy cried out. Jonah reached him first, lifting him without thinking. The child clung tight, fear giving way to trust in an instant. Clara watched from the doorway, heart pounding, torn between anger and gratitude. When the storm passed, Jonah set the boy down gently, and Clara saw it then. The way Jonah looked at her son, not with ownership, but with fierce protectiveness. Later, with the boy asleep, Clara stood at the table kneading dough, hands shaking. Jonah leaned against the wall, the silence heavy but not empty. "You never told me his name," Jonah said softly. Clara hesitated, then answered, "Thomas, named after his father." The word father hung between them. Jonah nodded, pain flickering across his face. "He was a good man," she added quickly. "Defensive. He loved Thomas. He loved me." Jonah believed her, and that made it hurt worse. "I don't doubt it," he said, "but loving you was never something I stopped doing." Clara slammed the dough down, breath hitching. "You don't get to say that. Not now, not after everything." She finally faced him, tears shining but "I waited for you, Jonah, longer than I should have. Every rider that came down that road I thought it was you. Every winter I told myself you'd return. When you didn't, I buried you same as I buried him." Jonah stepped closer, voice rough. "I was wrong. I chased something hollow, and by the time I turned back I was ashamed to face what I'd broken." Clara laughed softly, bitter and sad. "Shame don't raise children," she said. Jonah reached out but stopped short, hands clenched. "I can help now," he said. "If you let me." The days that followed settled into a fragile routine. Jonah worked the land, repaired what time had worn thin, and slowly earned Thomas's laughter. Clara watched it all with guarded eyes, her heart a battleground. At night, she lay awake, listening to Jonah's steps outside, remembering how safe she once felt, knowing he was near. She told herself that wanting him was weakness, that needing him was dangerous. Yet when trouble came in the form of a stranger riding up with hard eyes and harder questions about land deeds and debts, Jonah stepped forward without hesitation, standing between Clara and the threat, voice calm but unyielding. And Clara felt something shift inside her, something she had sworn was dead that night. She confronted him beneath the same cottonwood, moonlight painting him in silver. You're confusing things, she said, voice unsteady. Jonah met her gaze. I ain't confusing nothing. I'm facing it. She shook her head, hands trembling. I had a husband, a life, a promise made after you left. Jonah nodded slowly, respect clear in his eyes. And I won't dishonor that, but don't ask me to pretend what's between us never mattered. Clara looked away, tears spilling free at last. You ain't my husband, she whispered again, but this time her voice held no strength, and Jonah knew the land was tightening its grip, pulling them toward a reckoning neither could outrun. The trouble Jonah had sensed did not stay hidden long. It rode in one afternoon on the backs of 3 men with dust hard on their coats and hunger in their eyes. They carried papers stamped and signed, speaking of debts Clara's late husband had never mentioned, of land marked for seizure, of a widow who owed more than she could pay. Clara stood tall but pale. Thomas clutched her skirt, and Jonah felt the old fire rise in his chest, the kind that once sent him chasing danger instead of facing responsibility. This time he did not run. He read the papers slow, asked questions sharp, and spoke with a calm authority that surprised even him. When the men left with warnings instead of victory, Clara realized something had shifted. Jonah was no longer the man who fled when weight pressed down. That night, Clara finally broke. Sitting at the table long after Thomas slept, staring at a candle burned low. I didn't tell you everything, she confessed, voice barely holding. Jonah listened without interrupting. She spoke of fear, of debts hidden to protect her child, of a marriage built more on survival than passion. He was kind, she said, but he wasn't you. The words spilled out before she could stop them. Tears followed fast. Jonah reached for her hand, and this time she did not pull away. I never meant to love you still, she whispered, but love don't always listen to reason. Jonah squeezed her fingers gently. Neither do regrets, he said, but we can choose what we do with them. Days later, the truth she had carried alone finally surfaced. Clara stood with Jonah by the riverbank where they once talked of futures neither understood. Thomas played nearby, laughter bright against the steady flow of water. I need to tell you something, she said, voice shaking. Jonah turned fully toward her. Whatever it is, we'll face it. She took a breath, deep and painful. Thomas is yours, she said. The world seemed to still. Jonah dropped to one knee without realizing, breath stolen from his lungs. He looked at the boy, really looked, seeing himself clear as day. Clara sobbed then. I found out after you left, and by the time you returned I didn't know how to tear everything open again. Jonah closed his eyes, tears tracing lines down a face weathered by loss. You should have told me, he said softly, but without anger. She nodded, shame heavy. I was afraid you'd leave again. Jonah did not leave. Not when the truth cut deep, not when fear whispered old habits in his ear. He stayed and learned what it meant to be a father, patient, present, steady. Thomas warmed to him quick, as children do when they feel safety. Clara watched it unfold with equal parts hope and terror. One evening as the sun dipped low, Jonah spoke words she had waited years to hear. I should have been here from the start. I can't change that, but I won't fail him again, or you. Clara's defenses crumbled then. She leaned into him, forehead pressed to his chest, crying not from pain but release, the kind that only comes when a burden is finally shared. The men returned once more, harder this time, but they found a household no longer divided. Jonah stood firm, Clara beside him, documents corrected, debts settled through hard negotiation and harder work. The land remained theirs, not because of luck, but because they fought for it together. That night they sat on the porch, Thomas asleep between them, stars bright overhead. Clara spoke the words she had practiced 1,000 times in silence. I told you, you weren't my husband. Jonah smiled gently. I know. She met his eyes, voice steady at last. But you are the man who stayed, and that matters more than titles ever did. Jonah did not rush her. Love earned slow tastes sweeter. Days turned into weeks, weeks into something solid. Neighbors noticed the change, the laughter. The light returned to the homestead. Clara found herself smiling without guilt, trusting without fear. One evening Jonah asked her, not with grand vows but quiet sincerity, would you let me build a life here, with you? Clara answered by taking his hand and placing it over her heart. You already have. She said the wedding was small, just land and sky and those who mattered. No preacher needed beyond the promises they spoke themselves. Thomas stood proud between them, Jonah's hand steady on his son's shoulder. Clara looked at Jonah with eyes clear and certain. no shadows left to hide behind. When she said "I do," it carried the weight of every storm they had survived, every lie spoken in fear, every truth finally claimed years later. When Clara would remember the day she said, "You ain't my husband," she would smile softly, knowing how close she had come to losing everything that mattered. Love had not arrived easy or clean. It came dusty, scarred, and stubborn, like the land itself. And Jonah Cross, the man who once rode away, became the man who stayed. Because sometimes the truest love is not the one that arrives perfect, but the one that returns, humbled, ready, and willing to stand its ground.